Welcome to the Jewelry Connoisseur Podcast. And now your host, Sonia Esther Soltani.
Hi, welcome to this new episode of the Jewelry Connoisseur Podcast. I'm your host today. I'm Sonia Esther Soltani. I'm the editor-in-chief at Rapaport. And my guest today is Francesca Brickell. Hi, Francesca. Absolutely delighted to have you on the podcast today. You're the author of The Cartiers, which I think is certainly the jewelry history book that has been the most discussed since it launched last autumn. A lot of people have recommended it, praised it, loved it. I'm one of them. I think it's a beautiful history book into the brand. Just to give a bit of background to our listeners who haven't read it yet, it chronicles the story of your family from the beginning of the store, the Cartier store in Paris. That was in 1847. Up to the end of middle 1970s, when the family business wasn't part of the family anymore. And it seems a bit crazy to say that there was a time in America in the 20th century when people didn't know who Cartier was. They didn't know how to pronounce Cartier even as a name, because it's such an iconic jewelry brand all over the world. I think we will take the whole podcast just to name all the famous collectors of Cartier. But today, since we want to cover themes that will be of interest to our listeners on estate jewelry and jewelry history, Francesca, I would like us to cover a few highlights of Cartier prestigious history. So I'll start with, in the news, we just saw it was last week, from the time of this recording, Sotheby's sold a beautiful Tutti Frutti bracelet for 1.3 million. And what's more extraordinary is that this was an online sale. It's the biggest online sale so far. And shows something is that you don't even need to see a piece of Cartier Tutti Frutti jewelry to want to buy it, because it's such an iconic, well-known style and such a rare, precious piece of jewelry. And as the great-granddaughter of Jacques Cartier, who went to India with his brother Louis, started where the creators of this style. Can you tell us a bit more about India, the importance of India in Jacques and Louis' creations, and with all the stories you heard from your grandfather Jean-Jacques, and also from the sources you explored over the 10 years of your research that led to the writing of the book?
Sure. Well, yeah, that was a phenomenal result at the auction, and really exciting. And it was fun. I was involved in a small way in the auction. I did a kind of, it being in lockdown, I can't fly around the world, but I did an Insta live with Sotheby's before to try and bring to life some of the history, and show some of my great grandfather's diaries and photographs of those trips to India. Because to me, the value of those Tutti Frutti pieces is, yes, it's in the craftsmanship and in the gems, but also in that kind of fantastic exotic heritage. Yeah, as you say, Jacques Cartier was my great grandfather, and so first of all, let's step back a second. The three Cartier brothers inherited the small Parisian jewelry firm that their grandfather had founded, right? So they came on the scene in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they inherited this Parisian business, and they shared a dream to turn this local business into the leading jewelry firm in the world. And to do that, they had a plan, and their plan was to split the world between them, divide and conquer. So Louis, the eldest brother, he felt it was his right to have the Paris headquarters. Pierre, the middle brother, wanted America, and he went off and set up Cartier New York. And that fell to my great-grandfather Jack, the youngest brother, to take over the London branch. But with London, of course, went the British colonies, the most important of which was India. So it was that, like, when Jack was 27 years old, he found himself on a ship bound for India. And the year was 1911, which was no coincidence, because that was the year of the Great Delhi Durbar, kind of when all the Indian princes would be in Delhi to celebrate the coronation of the new British king, King George V. And so Jack went there at this time because it would be a perfect opportunity to meet as many of these ruling princes, who, by the way, were some of the biggest jewelry buyers in the world, all at one time and in one place. Very effective way of doing it. So he went with his suitcases of jewels, and he went to this Delhi Durbar, and he literally was a bit like a traveling salesman. He went around the different Maharajas' encampments trying to meet them and to show them these jewelry from Cartier, this European jewelry firm. And the Durbar was actually a bit disappointing for him in terms of sales, because he said while he'd taken out all the delicate diamond garland style tiaras and necklaces and corsage ornaments that were in such fashion in Paris at the time, in India, the Maharajas were not buying for their women, as the men did in Paris. They were buying for themselves. So they didn't want these delicate items. So he didn't actually manage to sell many of the jewels he'd bought. What he did sell was pocket watches, because the Maharajas wanted this kind of what was in fashion in Paris at the time with the men, the pocket watches. But the trip was really good in terms of building up relationships with the Maharajas. And over the years, Jack would travel back to India many, many times. And I'm lucky enough to have his diaries where he talks about those trips. And they're quite fun. He travels with his wife, Nellie, on some of the trips. And they go, because Nellie needs her 18 suitcases of clothes. She takes her dresser along with her. And because Jack's been a bit ill, he got very ill, actually. He got gassed in World War One. He takes his doctor with him, and they go by Rolls-Royce. They take their Rolls-Royce all the way from England to India, and this team from kind of Surrey in England travel around India, and they go on great, they have great adventures. And where the Rolls, sometimes they encounter a stream that crosses the road, and the locals have to quickly make a raft for the Rolls-Royce. Or on one trip, when a salesman's trying to get across the Himalayas to Nepal to go and meet the king of Nepal to try and sell him jewelry, the Rolls-Royce can't drive over the Himalayas. So the locals literally take it apart piece by piece, carry over like a wheel, a steering wheel, a door, and then put the rolls back together the other side of the Himalayas, and off they drive to Nepal. So they go on these great adventures, and all around, Jack is writing about what he sees and sketching what he sees. Everything from carvings in a temple, and it was very interesting because I actually followed his steps around the country, and I went to some of the temples he'd been to, and I could place the sketches in his diary with the exact carving he'd seen. And I also suddenly saw how a particular Indian motif he'd sketched then became the shape on a tiara that he'd made in 1936. It was really exciting to see that. But he also talked a lot about the colour in India and that kind of explosion of multicoloured. And he said in India, one does not see as under the English light. It's just a kind of explosion of vividness and brightness. And it's really this that he wanted to recreate in his Tutti Frutti jewels. So he wanted to give most of his clients in Europe, and even Louis, his brothers, and Pierre hadn't been to India. And they had lots of books on India, but the books were generally not in colour. And they didn't really bring to life that explosion of life, of brightness. And that's what he wanted to recreate for his clients back home. So he brought back with him these carved gemstones, carved rubies, carved emeralds, carved sapphires. And they were generally carved into the shapes of leaves or buds. And they were relatively affordable compared to the big stones because they were quite small. And because they were carved, that if there had been flaws in the stone, the flaws could be carved out of them. So they're relatively affordable. So it wasn't that they were like the big value items, but they were still the big effect items because he was combining all these, the colours together in a way that was very bold for the time back in the West. That wasn't at all the fashion at the time. The fashion was for more monotone pieces. So that was really the kind of genesis of this Tutti Frutti style.
That was big breakthrough actually in jewelry because it seemed like Art Deco had been more, as you said, monochromatic palettes and sapphire diamonds, onyx jewelry. So suddenly there was the explosion of exotic colors. That's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was really because it was a bit, unusual and rebellious almost. It was picked up on by some of the trendsetters of the day. People like Daisy Fellows who didn't like to follow the trends; they liked to make them. And of course, what they wore was kind of then written about in Vogue, and suddenly everyone else wanted it too. So when Daisy Fellows bought the Collier Indu in 1936, which was this amazing Tutti Frutti necklace, kind of the real culmination of the Tutti Frutti necklaces, probably. That made a real statement, and it became even more popular among other people as well. But they did great things with them. There's one in the V&A museum that used to belong to Lady Mountbatten, which is a tutti frutti tiara that Jack made in London in 1928. But it can also be split into 2 bracelets. So I love that one. I think it's great.
Oh, it's a stunning piece. It is
Yeah.
stunning. And I think we associate so many iconic creations to Cartier. The garland necklaces that you mentioned that Jacques traveled with to India, the tutti frutti. Then I hope we'll be able to talk about other creations. But before we go into the pieces, the jewels, can you tell us a bit more about what is the Cartier style? Because there's something that I think comes across in the book very nicely. But what is it? What's this magical creation that is called a Cartier jewel?
Yeah, it's true. It's something I really wanted to kind of approach in the book because I'd come into jewelry not from a jewelry background. I'd come in. I actually used to work in finance, but I was kind of the more I spoke to my grandfather and about the past, and when I discovered this trunk of letters in his cellar, which kind of opened up this window into a different era. That's how I kind of got drawn into the story. But I really, and because of that, I spoke to lots of gem experts and dealers, and so many of them said to me, always a kind of common point of what they said to me was like, Cartier is so distinct. You can tell an antique Cartier piece; it just stands out. And I was always like, but how can you tell? Because they're all so different. As you say, you've got the garland style, diamond and platinum. Then you've got tutti frutti, which is bold mix of colours. You've got watches, you've got mystery clocks, you've got jabot pins, you've got tiaras, you've got bandeaus, you've got Maharaja's turban ornaments. You've got so many different things. How can you tell that they're all Cartier? And it was a question I asked my grandfather as well. And he used to say, well, it was so hard to say in a word. So he used to sit with me and look through the old catalogues from the auction houses and point out pieces that were Cartier and why they were Cartier. And basically, it all boils down to this motto that the Cartier brothers had, which was never copy, only create. And the idea was they could and should take inspiration from everywhere except from existing jewelry. And so Louis Cartier, when he started designing pieces, so it was really Louis actually who decided that they should have a unique style. Prior to Louis joining the firm, his father and grandfather had bought in pieces from other workshops and sold them on. There had been no unique Cartier style, really, no distinct style. But Louis decided they needed to create their own pieces. And to do that, he hired a team of designers from other fields. So he hired a lace maker, he hired an architect, he hired interior designers, he hired people who are experts in ceramics. He wanted to bring something new to the jewelry trade. But he also wanted them all to kind of have an understanding of classical art. And, it's no surprise that many of the Cartier designers were artists in their own right, and they'd studied at the best art school, École des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. My grandfather went there with the École Boulle in London and in New York as well. They'd often studied at the best art school. So they understood the kind of the classical proportions as well. And I think that was really important to Cartier, that the idea that they wanted to break convention, they wanted to create new, interesting pieces, but there was also a great respect for tradition and symmetry and proportion. And in fact, there was a really interesting letter from actually a speech that Pierre Cartier made. Pierre was the brother who went to New York. And he said that, artists need to breathe the air of Paris to create artistic models. And he said in New York, the problem was you had kind of skyscrapers next to tiny buildings. And he said that does nothing for the artist. How can an artist breathe and understand how to create beautiful pieces with that lack of symmetry and proportion? And so I think part of that Cartier style is the Parisian element as well. And it's interesting because even when Cartier New York was setting up their workshop and Cartier London was setting up their workshop, they sent out designers initially from Paris to train the people in America or to train the people in London. So that sense of Parisian proportion had to kind of flow through from the top. And as a result, I think you get this kind of very cohesive style. I mean, my grandfather he was an apprentice, and he trained under the top Cartier designer, Charles Jacquot. And he trained for 3 years under Jacquot. And during the day, he was training under Jacquot. And during the night, he was going to art school in the École des Arts Décoratifs And it was a very strict training. And it's not like you suddenly became a designer at Cartier and could start designing pieces. There was one funny story. There was a designer in London, a lovely man I met, an elderly man who I met, who worked under my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, in fact. And he said he joined, and he was very chuffed to have been given a job at Cartier London. And he joined, and he was quite confident because he'd been to art school. And he arrived, and he did a sketch the first day, and he thought, well, I've really shown them how great I am. And Mr. Cartier came up to him at the end of the day and said, well, it's very good, Gardner, but it's not quite Cartier. Try again. So Dennis came home a bit disillusioned that evening. And the next day he went in, he tried again. And the same response came back that day. Yeah, you're still not quite there. Try again. Watch what the other designers are doing. Sit with them. Look at them. So Gardner, this went on not just for the next couple of days or the next couple of weeks, but this went on for 3 years.
Yes, I remember the story from the book.
I went to go and see him, and I met him and his wife, and they were so sweet. They'd made me kind of, tea and Victoria sponge, and we sat with them having tea. And this story, he just got his wife then cut into the story at this point, and she said, she was lovely. She was called Mimi. She said, I still remember the moment Dennis walked through the door after those 3 years, and he was just ecstatic. And he said, I've got it, Mimi. I've finally got it. And from then on, he was off, and he designed pieces from everyone, for everyone from Elton John to the Queen of England, and he was one of the top Cartier.
I love that story in the book because I thought your grandfather really gave him his chance, and also the way that came from his uncles and from his father, the way of seeing potential in craftsmen and really encouraging them. And you mentioned it in the book, from all the apprentices that joined a Cartier workshop, very few actually would be still there after a few years because the standard was extremely high, and some of them would go somewhere else. It wasn't because you entered Cartier that you carried on working for Cartier if you didn't meet the standards, the exacting standards of craftsmanship.
Exactly, and it was often, some apprenticeships were 6-7 years for the craftsmen, and but you're right. They gave. I remember my grandfather telling me that his father, Jack, had given a job to the chauffeur's son, the chauffeur who drove them around India in the Rolls Royce. And his son, Jack, had seen potential in his son because he'd seen him at the house doing certain things, and just the way he seemed to understand, have an aesthetic sense. And he gave a job to the chauffeur's son, and he ended up being one of the best craftsmen, which is a lovely story. But you're right, because even the craftsmen who didn't make it through the apprenticeship period, each year some of them would be, wouldn't make it through to the next year. Apparently they could still get excellent jobs in the industry, because even 1 year training at Cartier as an apprentice was enough to be, a relatively senior craftsman elsewhere.
But you had to be such an extraordinarily talented craftsman to be able to work for Cartier, because some of the design, I would like us to you to tell us a bit more about, some of the watches or the mystery clocks. I know Christie's is going to sell a whole beautiful collection of mystery clocks in I think the coming week, and just the shape of some of the watches or some of the mechanism, the high level of skills that were involved in his creations. It's no wonder they collectors items, and they perform so well in auction houses. What kind of highlights would you like to share with us from the items, the jewels that you think are really on a from for a collector? What that would be interesting to know a bit more. I was thinking of the Santos watch because of its origin and the story behind it. What would you like to tell us? What could you share?
Yeah, no, well, I will. Yeah, the Santos and the mystery clock. I think they all show us different things. You were saying the mystery clock before. I'll talk about the Santos in a minute, but the mystery clock. My grandfather told me the story of how his Uncle Louis was. Uncle Louis had he was brilliant, an absolute creative genius, and had these great visions for how things should be or could be. He'd actually done awfully at school because he refused to follow the rules. The teacher's report said, his head is in the clouds. He's not focusing enough. But it was the very fact that his head was in the clouds that he was able to come up with these ideas. But coming up with this idea of this mystery clock and taking it to, this was another thing I found extraordinary. He didn't have a background in clocks, but that didn't stop him. He found the top expert who did. He worked with Coué on the mystery clocks, and he had this idea and he was convinced it could be done. And he took it to the clockmakers and the workshop, and the designers had to work very closely with the clockmakers because the designers, of course, had to understand the mechanism in order to design a piece around it. So they worked in collaboration, but the piece wasn't quite as Louis wanted it, and he kept sending it back to the workshop. My grandfather told me the first mystery clock took a year to make. And each time Louis sent it back, they said, well, it can't be done in the way you want. And he just absolutely insisted. And it was that, I think, Cartier perfectionism and insistence on the best, which means those pieces do still reach records at auction today because they were so brilliantly made. And even, 100 years later, they stand out. So I think the mystery clocks, whenever I see one, I think of Louis, and I'm like, apparently the workshop was just terrified of him every time he would storm back in. Like tear strips off them, was the expression Grandpa would use. But it worked. It got the result. But yeah, so the Santos is the first wristwatch really that Cartier made for men, and the more research I did into it, the more I realised how brilliantly innovative it was at the time, really, because so the story goes that Alberto Santos Dumont, this Brazilian aviator, who was a real character, would fly around Paris in his flying machines. Some of them looked kind of like a bit like a hot air balloon on it. There's one that looked like a hot air balloon on its side, like kind of a giant rugby ball flying through the sky. And he used to kind of apparently fly, stop off at restaurants and bars and just tie it to a lamppost as he popped in for a glass of champagne.
I'm sorry, I was just going to interrupt you, Francesca, because I would like to say your book has such a phenomenal gallery of characters, of colorful characters, and Santos is one of them. But you just said in a little anecdote. So it's such a pleasure to meet these collectors, these jewelry lovers, and people who also push the boundaries of fashion and technology and style. So I think that really that's one of the elements of the books. It's not just about the Cartiers, but also the people around them that nurture their creativity and the exchange of ideas and just inspirations between these very strong characters from the 20th century. So sorry to interrupt, but it's something I thought that's very important to mention, that it's not just about the family history, it's really so much about all the people.
Yes, and that's what was so fun to research, to dive into their lives. That's why it took so long. That's why my father kept saying, come on, enough. This is not a book about them. This is a book about your family. But I could have gone on, and I did so much research about all these fascinating people, because you're right, the people who the Cartiers were mixing with were kind of often brilliant in their own fields, not in the jewelry field necessarily. There was, for example, Cocteau, of course, Jean Cocteau, who was artist in the literature, playwright, poet, but pushing the boundaries of his field. And Santos, who was an aviator and pushing the boundaries of his field. And so, for the Cartiers to be mingling with these people was I think it must have been an incredibly exciting time to live.
Absolutely. And how do you create a watch for someone who has his own plane to go and drink champagne?
Exactly. So Santos, he was, and Santos was friends of Louis Cartier, apparently, not surprisingly, given that they both kind of like this idea of pushing the rules, pushing convention, doing things differently. But he and one evening, apparently he was at Maxime's in Paris, the fashionable restaurant at the time, with Louis, and he was there to collect an award, or he'd just collected an award for one of the flying races through Paris. And he was complaining that he couldn't, or talking to Louis about how it had been annoying for him because he couldn't time himself. It was a race it was a timed race. He couldn't time himself as he was racing because he couldn't put his hand in his pocket to pick out his pocket watch, because obviously his hands had to be on the controls. And it was said to be that inspired Louis to come up with the idea of putting the watch effectively on his wrist and attaching it with a strap. Now, this wasn't entirely a new idea, because men had tied pocket watches to their wrists in the Boer War, and previous times when they they'd had to. But that wasn't what Louis wanted to do. He didn't want to tie a pocket watch to one's wrist. Louis was all about it had to form and function had to work perfectly together. So if there was going to be some type of timepiece on the wrist, it had to attach to the wrist in a totally seamless way. It had to look like one beautiful object. And so he came up with the idea of this Santos watch, where it would be attached with a leather strap, and it would have this sapphire winder, and it would have beautiful numbers on it, a beautiful dial. So the whole thing would be a piece of beauty. It'd almost be like a jewel with the sapphire winder. It was a nod to his jeweler's background. It wasn't simply something from a watchmaker. And he worked closely with Edmund Jaeger, the watchmaker at the time, and they came up with this watch. They came up with a buckle for the watch as well, the buckle deployer. And in time they marketed it to the public. But to me, what was so interesting was, if you think now, of course, you look around and everyone's got watches, men and women. But back then, watches, the word for watches in French, women they were montre bracelet, weren't they? They were like bracelets, and women wore watches, but they wore them with a diamond strap or a silk strap, and they were very feminine. So to ask a man to wear a watch was like asking a man in a way to wear a bracelet. Louis had to effectively change the entire mentality, the way people looked at this item. And he did that brilliantly through Santos, because Santos they said he was a character, but he was this huge global celebrity. His picture was on plates, it was on matchbox cases, it was in newspapers, it was all over the world. He was one of the biggest, the most famous people in the world at the time. So for Louis to not only give this first watch to Santos, but also to call it the Santos, it meant the fashionable men about town looked to Santos as this trendsetter and said, "Oh, what's he wearing?" And suddenly it became okay for a man to wear a watch. And that's what I found so interesting as well, is that I mentioned before, this never copy, only create when it came to the style, the Cartier style, but it was also when it came to the marketing, they kind of came up with the idea of these early brand ambassadors, before that was even, before that had a name.
And it seems like you mentioned in the book there are other iconic watches, the Tank watch, and a few other, the Baignoire, some that are just inspired by Salvatore Dali's clocks. So it would take a whole podcast just to explain how difficult it was for the craftsmen when this idea came up. And I love it. I think one of artists, is it Andy Warhol, who had a tank who didn't work, and he says it doesn't matter because he doesn't wear it because he needs a watch, but because he wanted a tank watch.
Yes, exactly. When he was asked, that's it, why he never wound his tank, he said, "I don't wear a watch to tell the I don't wear a tank to tell the time. I wear a tank because it's a watch to wear." Brilliant.
Exactly. And so there's half amazing in this generation, in the generation of Louis, Pierre, and Jacques. Suddenly Cartier became such a must-have brand. So, and I think now we're seeing a lot of estate dealers. I think one of the watches for sure, but I think also the Panthère, the Panthère jewelry, maybe a brooch or a watch with the onyx, the diamonds. What was so special about this Panthère?
I think that was interesting as well, researching the Panthère, because I think the Panthère motif had been around in Cartier from the early 20th century, as you said. I think the Panthère really came, it was with the Duchess of Windsor, probably after the Second World War, when she bought multiple pieces of Panthère jewelry, that really set off the big cat trend in jewels. And, because she was linked with the Panthère jewels, they became associated with this image of a strong woman. And Jean Toussaint was in charge of the creative side of Cartier at that time, so they kind of became linked with her and the Duchess of Windsor. And I think since then it's become more iconically related to Cartier, perhaps. But what I found was interesting was, in fact, as you say, Cartier were creating kind of Panthère-themed pieces much, much earlier than that. And I mentioned Charles Jacquot before, Louis' head designer, who my grandfather said was so important in developing the Cartier style. Him and Louis worked closely together on so many things. And I've seen pictures of Jacquot, from before the First World War, where he's sketching panthers, and he came up with this panther motif kind of watch bracelet with diamonds and onyx. I think that was in 1909 or something. And then, of course, I mentioned Jack going to India, and he talks a lot about, he stays all over the place. And sometimes him and Nellie stay in really rough station houses, sleeping on the floor, but at other times they stay in luxury and palaces. And part of those palace stays is often a panther shoot. And they talk about the thrilling panther shoots, and there are photos of them there with the Maharaja and the panthers. And so you see this theme of panthers kind of being part of their lives, really. And I've got my grandfather's old book of the Jungle Book, which was his favourite story as a child. And you can see that in that book, this would have been in the 1920s, so well before the Duchess of Windsor and her panthers. But in this book, it's really sweet because it's obviously his bedtime story that his father's reading him. And then his father's obviously taken the book back down to his study after his son's gone to bed, and has circled an image of the panther and written little notes next to it about how they might turn it into a design on a cigarette box. So I love the idea that this kind of idea of panther is coming from so many different sources, and then as I say, yes, by the kind of 1950s, it's being associated with the Duchess of Windsor or Barbara Hutton, or these strong women.
And it's still a big hit among estate jewelry collectors, because it's so timeless. The symbol of it is
such an elegant,
so well. There's something you mentioned. Your grandfather as a boy. Jean-Jacques was the last one to actually manage a family-run branch in London.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by the time you were, that was 1974, I think, when he left the business and retired.
Yeah, exactly.
So you actually never knew him as Jean-Jacques Cartier running the store. But after all the exchanges you had, all the time you spent with him, and you ask him to be able to collect his memories, what do you see as your grandfather's own style? What was this interest? What did he contribute to the Cartier catalogue of beautiful creations that you particularly like, and you would like to share with us?
Yeah, well, I think Grandpa was an artist. He was a modest, humble, kind of introverted man who said that he should have been spending his lunch breaks at work meeting clients in Browns in Mayfair, just like his father had done. But he said he left that to the salesman, and he used to buy a sandwich from the Italian little coffee shop on the corner, eat it as fast as he could, so he had time to wander around the galleries and Sotheby's and Christie's and just absorb the art, So I think he, as I mentioned before, he trained under this Charles Jacquot, the Paris' head designer. He went to art school every evening. He'd grown up with his father's artistic sensibilities as well, and design sense. So he really understood the Cartier style from a young age. And what he loved was, well, first of all, just take a step back a bit. He joined the firm after the Second World War. And at that time, it was an almost impossible time to be running a jewelry firm, a luxury jewelry firm, because the tax on jewelry at that stage was 125%. So can you imagine, before the Second World War, his father had been creating tiaras, for the coronation, and phenomenal pieces, biggest necklaces, in Cartier London's history for the Maharajas. And then suddenly the Second World War happens. My grandfather's father sadly passes away. He's a young man who's done his apprenticeship, and he's suddenly having to take over Cartier London at a time when no one can possibly think of buying jewelry. There's still rationing in England. So he has to kind of rethink everything that he's been taught, really, and think, well, what can we be creating at this time? And so I think he really turned his attention to more practical items, like watches. He built up the watch Wright and Davis workshop in East London, like cases. And where he did do jewels, yes, there were a few big pieces. Of course, there are always exceptions, but generally where he did do jewels, they tended to be, people were buying smaller items, And he made a lot of animal brooches and flower brooches, and I love them because I remember growing up, Grandpa was amazing with just a pencil and a scrap of paper, and he would suddenly, he would sketch away, and suddenly you'd have an animal springing to life on that paper. And those bird brooches he made mean a lot to me because I've got so many sketches of his little birds. And also because I live now in his house in France, and his garden is filled with all the flowers he planted, and the garden is filled with the bird song. So whenever I see a little brooch, a flower brooch or a bird brooch, it really does remind me of him. But he also did pieces like, he was also not afraid to kind of break with convention, and he was running the business. That fourth generation, it was very different for them. They were running the business in the 1960s. Which was such a rebellious time when you compare that to the 20s and 30s. And so he had to jewelers at that time had to adjust to what people were asking for. And they weren't asking for the same big jewelry pieces, the big tiaras, or the same pieces that their parents had worn. They wanted something different. So I did ask my grandfather about how he came up with the idea, for example, for the crash watch, which again is another iconic watch nowadays. And he'd said, it was a swinging 60s, people were wanting something a bit different. And he had the idea there was this Paris oval watch, a bit like, oval shaped Benoit watch. And he thought he would just adjust it slightly by putting a kink in it and pinching the ends and making it look a bit like it had been in a crash. So I thought that was interesting, the way that he'd been taught very traditionally within this Cartier style. And many of the pieces he made are very symmetrical and timeless, but he wasn't afraid to kind of break with that and do something out of the ordinary as well.
And that's, I guess that's one of your personal favorites, the bird brooch, because of the connection to your grandfather. What is the Cartier piece that is maybe in the famous collection that we know of, or that has been sold in auction, that you think is really something that epitomized the Cartier style?
See, that is hard because there's so many different
There's so many.
Aren't there? I mean, I love it is so hard because the garland style, which is so delicate and almost lace-like, is stunning, but it's so different to that. That was before the First World War, for the very feminine kind of dresses and the big corsage ornaments. It's a fantastic garland style corsage ornament, isn't there, that's sold in the recent the Christie's auction last year. The
Maharaja and
yes, that was not a Maharaja.
Which brings us back to India, actually, and the dialogue between two cultures. Yes, yeah, that
exactly. And I mean, there was some, so there's a stunning diamond platinum corsage ornament that sold in that auction, which I adored. But there's also, then they got the bright, colourful ones. There was one, a belt buckle. Did you see that one? It was emerald and sapphire and diamond belt buckle, very kind of geometrical, but also Indian, had an Indian feel. And I love that as well. They're two very different pieces, but both, I think, classically Cartier and striking in their own way. Oh, there are so many pieces. I don't know.
But I think people who read your book or who read your book will appreciate even more the work, the craftsmanship. I think what I enjoyed very much about your book is not just the family history and there's a lot of tenderness for these memories that your grandfather shared with you, but also the homage you pay to all the craftsmen who were involved in the Cartier business, because you had the leading forces of Louis, of course, and Pierre, the more the businessman, the one who set up the Cartier store in New York, and your great-grandfather Jacques in London, who also, brought so much from his trip, from his imagination, from his culture. But you have the craftsmen who also made it happen. And I think the book really is a wonderful thing, that it takes a whole beautiful team to create such high pieces of jewelry.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So yeah, I think that's something that really touched me in a book. And I think if you like jewelry, if you like history, because it's also a book that starts in 1847 through 1974. So you can imagine that a lot of things happen, world wars and many things in between. and the characters you meet in that book are absolutely fascinating.
Well, that was kind of, that was actually one of my motivations, because I think my grandfather felt strongly that, it was, as you say, it was totally a team effort, and they had some incredible people working for them, and that these people Cartier had a policy, which wasn't unusual, many jewelers did, of keeping the people behind the scenes. You put the Cartier name on the piece, you didn't put the designer's name on the piece or the craftsman's name on the piece. So they're effectively unsung heroes, and he felt they deserved to be recognized. In London, Paris, and New York, there are incredible designers. There was one story. So when they were setting this emerald necklace for a Maharaja, Jacques gave the setter 2 days off work. So he was totally calm. So his hands didn't shake at all, because emeralds are quite fragile, and this carved emerald was incredibly valuable and a historical stone, and any slight shake of the hand could have caused the emerald to crack. And when you kind of realize that, you'll realize, oh my gosh, every part of this process, from the design to the mounter to the setter, and then you have these expert polishers that my grandfather was saying, like an expert polisher can kind of polish out the tiniest flaw, but you don't polish out too much so that the stone, becomes smaller. It's such an art every step of the way. Which I didn't appreciate that before at all. But I actually managed to track down, that was part of my research, which I loved, tracking down some of these specialists, these experts, or in the case where they passed away, tracking down their descendants and really understanding their role. And what struck me was their dedication to their job, and their loyalty to the firm, and just their respect for it. And they worked for Cartier not because there were enormous salaries, but because they had such pride in their work, and they were so proud to be working for this firm. And it was almost like this huge extended family. And now some of those people I've tracked down, I feel like they're my family. Now in this coronavirus time, I've been calling them up and finding out how they all are. We've been having long chats, and it was such a collaborative effort, as you say.
And yes, and I think, as we mentioned before, you spent 10 years researching this book, because there was so much. And every time you read a new telegram, or you read a new letter, it opens the whole world and a whole new connection to another collector or another craftsman. So it's really a beautiful historical book, I thought. Regardless of people are interested in jewelry or not, just as a family history, a history of a business, through 4 generations. And if people haven't read it yet, I think I would just recommend just get it.
Oh, thank you.
And also gift it. That's a book that you want to share with other people, because it's like so many lively stories. And I think you mentioned some of the famous collectors. You only mentioned collectors who are not alive anymore, out of respect and for privacy. The only people that you mentioned are the royal family of England as collectors. But so it's really a story that takes you through so many universes: the fashion, art, politics, history. So I absolutely love this book. I think I read it in lockdown, I think less than a week, because I wanted to know what's happening. And I'm not even mentioning the love stories between some of the characters. I'm just going to finish it with the story of your grandfather, Jean-Jacques, how during the war he traveled to the south of France to visit his fiancée, and the risk he took to actually be able to see her. I think is so romantic and so beautiful.
Yeah, well, that's it. Because fundamentally, I wanted it to be a human story, about 4 generations and the highs and lows. And that's what I kind of really discovered as well, is that these characters who, yes, Louis was this creative genius, but he could also be difficult and impatient, and, could fly into a rage. And everyone's got, it's real life. People have great sides and less good sides, and there's love and there's fear and there's jealousy, but that's real, so that's what I wanted to kind of to show.
And it's really beautifully rendered. And as I said, it's a wonderful family story, really, beyond the jewels, beyond the the creations that a lot of our listeners will be familiar with. I think that just will give them such a deeper appreciation of a Cartier piece when they next see it.
Yeah, I hope so. I think, well, for me, that's what's always interested me about the jewelry, is the stories behind it and the people behind it. And what you realize of jewelry is why it's so fascinating is there's the people behind its creation, but then there are all the people who have owned it as well. And so that was great fun following pieces like the Romanov emeralds, from Russia and then being smuggled out of Russia after the revolution and then ending up in America, and Jazz Age America and Cartier make them into a 1920s sautoir, and then the Great Depression happens and they have to be sold again, and they end up in London and they're made into a big necklace and a big ring, and then they move again and eventually they're split up. But just following those gems, it's the story of people as well, and of changing times. That's what I found.
Absolutely. So if anyone is still looking for book recommendation, this is it. I think it's been already translated in a few languages, and I know you're working on more translations, because there's clearly a book of global interest. Francesca, thank you so much for your time. I know you're juggling a lot of things during this lockdown, homeschooling and other obligations. So thank you so much for having shared this interview with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we're going to conclude this podcast. And I would like you, as a conclusion, do you have another book that you'd like to recommend about the Cartiers that our listeners might be interested to read to further their knowledge?
Yeah, well, I think probably, for me and my research, I think the best book and was something my grandfather felt as well, the kind of Bible on Cartier, has got to be the Hans Nagelhofer's book on Cartier, written in the 1980s, really, which just covers the history. His is more of the history of the jewelry. Mine is more history of the people and the family. So hopefully together they really give you a full picture. But I think that is a very hard to beat book, fantastic book, Cartier by Hans Nagelhofer.
Fantastic. So take note, listeners, what you need on your bookcases, and especially to read, not just to put on a bookshelf, but also to read and appreciate. Thank you so much, Francesca. I wish you well, and to the next podcast. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us, the Jewelry Connoisseur Podcast. If you enjoyed this and would like more top-quality jewelry content, check out the Jewelry Connoisseur blog at jewelryconnoisseur.net.